If you're here, you probably already know something about the Alternate Realities Render Challenge. If you don't know what I'm talking about, everyone participating in the challenge was given a template project file for the 3D software of their choice that looked like this. The scene has to contain the sphere or circle element and a character linked to the provided motion capture data. So the main questions were what to do with the character, what to do with the sphere, and how to link it all together into one cohesive story. I wanted to come up with something unique to do with the sphere that wasn't a planet, space station, or empty void, and I wanted it to fit into the story with the character somehow, instead of just being an unrelated prop in the background. I decided on the spherical hologram billboard because it would fit within an urban, sci-fi, not too distant future kind of almost cyberpunk theme that I thought I could pull off at a decent quality within the time limit. In the real world, Tokyo is generally considered to be the most cyberpunk city, which not only inspired the kind of Tokyo Drift racing theme, it also gave me a real-world location to pull reference from. I went onto Google Street View and spent some time exploring Tokyo. When I found an area that I liked, I just wrote down all the details that I could see and saved links to their locations so I could come back later. Now, I don't consider myself to be a very good modeler or animator, so my approach to this scene definitely reflects that. Instead, I relied more on materials, lighting, and compositing. Let me show you what I mean. For the modeling, I basically just used the Hubert technique of extruding photographs of buildings. If you want to learn how to do that, check out his videos on the subject. I'll put links to those in the description. And that's basically all the modeling I did, besides these signs, which were super easy, and a few other details. Even the vending machines were basically made in the same way as the buildings. I even went so far as to use the provided sphere for the hologram instead of replacing it. Doing that also reduced the risk of being disqualified for having an improperly placed sphere. The video loop for the sphere was assembled in Adobe After Effects using stock footage, graphics, and an alternate angle of my scene from the news camera drone. Creating the alternate camera angle was as simple as making a new camera, moving it to a new location, and after some additional background modeling, rendering the scene. The simple UV unwrapping that I did didn't look the greatest, so I added a couple of rings around the sphere with the same video loop applied. As I added more and more detail, I was watching my VRAM usage and render time go up, and I realized that I had to work on optimizing the scene before adding more detail, otherwise I wouldn't have time to finish rendering by the deadline. This is where things got more interesting for me because I had to experiment with new ways to improve performance. I was happy with the background elements, so I decided to split the scene into foreground and background and render them separately. That way, I could render the background ahead of time to save render time later. But I found that because of the volumetric fog, the foreground still took an inconveniently long time to render, so I decided to render the fog separately as well. This allowed me to continue working on the foreground elements closer to the deadline without having to re-render the fog and background elements. Eventually, I decided that the foreground elements were acceptable as is, so I did a final render. However, I still had a few days left before the deadline, and I had a few things that I wanted to improve. So I decided to add more details, render them on alpha, and composite them in later. Using this method, I was able to improve the sign on the side of the building, the telephone pole, and several of the background buildings. Let's talk about the compositing. Besides combining the 3D render layers, I also composited color and bloom effects, a building and rooftop AC units in the background, and an additional lighting pass to add backlight to the character. Though I did the compositing in After Effects, what I did would also be possible within Blender. Let me briefly show you some of the compositing techniques I used to make the character stand out from the rest of the scene. The first thing I did was to render a version of the scene where the character's material was set to a white emission shader and the rest of the scene turned off entirely. This could then be used as a mask to independently control the luminance of the character. To create additional backlight, once again, turn off everything but the character, then add lights behind the character. I wasn't trying to be realistic here, so it was fine that the lights didn't illuminate the volumetric fog or the sidewalk. And because the visual difference between Cycles and Eevee would be minimal in this context, I rendered it in Eevee to save time. After rendering, it can be composited over the footage with a mix node set to screen mode. The intensity can then be controlled using the slider. That's all I'm going to cover in this video. If I didn't mention something that you really wanted to know more about, tell me down in the comments and I'll do my best to answer any questions you have. Thanks for watching this video. If you enjoy this content and you'd like to learn more about Blender, check out my other videos and please consider subscribing.